Hi, class. I'm going to talk about a few things from the last few chapters in the book, from chapters 25, 26, 27. I want to hit on some major themes. Now, as I said before in the last lecture, going from Johnson to Reagan, especially going from Nixon to Reagan, uh, there was an overall movement, a more conservative political climate in America. And this is something that we tend to see in American history, that America tends to have relatively short periods of really active progressivism, pretty strong liberal movements, and then pretty long periods of reaction. Now that's not 100%. You can't say that as a blanket statement, but that's a general pattern. I mean, if you look at in the 1930s, you have the New Deal. Then once the war is over, uh, the Congress changes parties, and then you have a more conservative movement. You have Taft-Hartley. You have a number. You have the constitutional amendment that limits the number of times the president can be elected. And there was an overall reaction to Roosevelt being president so long, and his the potential for that happening again was removed. Now, to go back to what I talked about earlier, in 1968, that was the time when you had very intense anti-war pressure. Both Senator Kennedy and, and Martin Luther King were assassinated, and eventually Richard Nixon ended up being president of the United States. Now, Nixon was far more conservative than Johnson, who preceded him. But Nixon's actual policies tended not to be all that terribly conservative. I mean, the major thing he did that modern day conservatives could identify with is that he did make an effort to appoint more conservative judges to the bench. But in terms of his social policies, to one degree or another, he pretty much maintained policies that had started under Johnson. And of course, Watergate forced him out of office, and then you have the Ford administration. The only president in American history who wasn't elected either as president or vice president. But he simply finished out Nixon's term, and then Jimmy Carter was elected. Jimmy Carter was probably, you know, he would be the last truly liberal president, really for about 38 years. I mean, it's not until you get to Obama that you have somebody who's comparatively as liberal. And even with Obama, he was much more informed by the conservative tendencies that had developed over the last 38 or so years. But anyway, to get to Reagan, Reagan, in a lot of ways, his everyday policies stayed fairly conservative, but some of his most important things were the signaling he did. Like, one of the most famous things he did was when he ran for office, and he made the statement that he supported states' rights in Neshoba County, Mississippi, which was a very, very famous county. I mean, that's where Philadelphia, Mississippi was, and where there was a famous civil rights murder in 1964. The three civil rights workers, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. And most people saw his open support of states' rights in Neshoba County, Mississippi. It's kind of a wink and nod to Southern conservatives. The fact that he was not going to be forcing social changes on them at the rate that had happened previously. Now, that said, Reagan still had to acknowledge changes that had occurred. I mean, like, for instance, he nominated and successfully got the first woman on the Supreme Court. But still, he did make significant changes in social programs. He had campaigned attacking what he referred to as welfare queens, people who he said were cheating on welfare. And what happened is that once he became president, he did turn welfare into a system of block grants where states got the money and they could, set up terms much more readily. Reagan also continued the policy of moving towards trying to appoint more conservative judges to the bench, too. And so therefore he created, although there wasn't momentous changes in a lot of areas of American life, he did create some significant changes. Now, one of the biggest things he did was that early on in his presidency, the Union of Air Traffic Controllers, PATCO was their acronym. They went on strike. Now, the significant thing about this is that federal law forbade federal employees from going on strike. However, under past presidents who were more sympathetic to unions, even though they were breaking the law, they did not put the full force of the law on them. In the case of Reagan, however, he simply fired all of the air traffic controllers and then got military air traffic controllers to take up the slack in civilian air traffic control until the government was able to train enough people to take the place of the workers who were fired. Now, this was a very important thing in American labor history because really for the first time since Herbert Hoover, 49 years earlier, this is the first time an American president squarely came out with an anti-union stance and was willing to really punish members of organized labor, which was very ironic because actually the air traffic controllers actually had endorsed Reagan during the 1980 election. But when Reagan fired these air traffic controllers, as Foner mentions in the book, this really sent a signal to private industry that they could be much more harsh in their treatment of labor unions and that the government would not give them any problems with it. Now, of course, one of the great ironies of this is that Ronald Reagan is the only union boss to ever become president. I mean, Reagan was head of the Screen Actors Guild Union back in the 1940s. But, history has a lot of irony in it. Now, the crackdown on labor plus growing deindustrialization in the United States really affected the United States economy. If you look throughout the 20th century, until you get to the 1970s, American heavy industry is growing pretty heavily. It actually starts slowing down in the 60s. But throughout the first 6.5 or so decades of the 20th century, American industry had been growing steadily and at times grew very, very fast. However, by the 1970s, industry is really starting to slow down. And there are a number of factors involved in this. First of all, going back to the end of World War II, American business had really invested heavily overseas. It had invested heavily in Europe. It had invested heavily in Japan. And also, once you start getting into the 1980s, we really see American investment starting to increase in China. And so industry leaves America pretty steadily from the 1970s throughout the end of the 20th century. This means that good paying factory jobs that had once been very common, especially in the Midwest and the East, and in the West also, that for that matter, really began to shrivel. If we look in this area, places like Granite City Steel, the old Alcoa aluminum plant, a lot of these places really start going into significant decline from the 80s onwards. And so this means that one of the great sources of middle-class jobs and middle-class stability leaves American economic life at this time. And one of the great ironies of this, of course, is that, by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, this is the first time you really have a significant population of African Americans and other minorities who are not subject to a lot of the discriminations that have been taking place in unions and some of the other areas. But the old jobs that once paid so well become much less plentiful. And nobody gets access to these jobs the way they used to get them. Now, as I said before, investment increased in China. And this really reflects the fact that the United States and China, going back to the Nixon administration, uh, have a fairly cordial relationship. Uh, the United States under Nixon moves toward establishing diplomatic relationships with China, largely to kind of pry China away from Vietnam and kind of take advantage of the space that had developed between China and Russia. And China really wanted to develop its economy because it's the biggest country in the world, but at that time was a relatively poor country because of its lack of economic development. And so what we see is that starting really, really picking up momentum in the 1980s is rapid economic growth in China. And I said that partly comes at the expense of American economic growth, but at the same time, it also creates a less stressful situation in Asia in terms of military tension. Because at that time, China was really developing its economy, and it was not in a position to militarily challenge the United States. Now, of course, that situation has changed now, but we're not going that far into the future. Now, after Reagan's term is over, we end up with the first President Bush, who largely continues Reagan's policies, but did not have Reagan's charisma. And also, once the 1992 election came around, just really made some significant political gaffes. I mean, there was a famous situation where he went to a grocery store and he didn't understand how the new digital cash registers worked. It was something that just let folks know that he was a pretty rich man who didn't have to do these kind of everyday things. And it just so happens that a Democrat, Bill Clinton, was able to take advantage of this and get elected. Now, the significant thing about Clinton is that Clinton, of course, came of age during the period of civil rights, the Vietnam War demonstrations, and that sort of thing. But he realized Clinton was, if nothing else, was a smart politician, and he realized that the overall climate in America was going in a more conservative direction. And so he did not really challenge the substance of a lot of the changes that Reagan developed. He was famous for saying that, the era of big government was over. And during the 1992 elections, he actually made it a point to publicly challenge some blacks who had, by this time, had become the most reliable supporter of the Democratic Party. There was a famous situation where he had a confrontation with a young rapper, Sister Soldier. He had a confrontation, a fairly mild one, with Jesse Jackson, and also he made a point of going off the campaign trail and staying in Little Rock while he was still governor of Arkansas to make sure that a black inmate, Ricky Ray Rector, was executed. And so, although Clinton did not get the majority of conservative voters, and for that matter, he didn't get the majority of white voters, he was able to pick off enough voters, plus he was able to hold on to a lot of traditionally Democratic voters, that he was able to be elected president. Now, the other thing that was significant too is that Ross Perot ran as president, and he split conservative vote, which allowed Clinton to get elected with a plurality as opposed to an outright majority. However, once he came into office, culturally he was fairly liberal, but he maintained a lot of kind of the government policies that Reagan had started, and he went along to a fair amount with Republican policies. One of the major exceptions to this was that he did attempt to expand health care. Very famously, his wife Hillary was in charge of that, but that did not work out so well. Republicans were able to block it, and really this is significant because as we know right now, relationships between the parties are more antagonistic than they've been probably since the Civil War. And I think we can all fairly make the argument that the man who would eventually become Speaker of the House during Clinton's time as president, Newt Gingrich, was really the man who really engineered that change in political attitude, a much more aggressive attitude towards the opposition party. He came out with what was known as the Contract with America, listing a number of things that he wanted to do to make the country more conservative. And he stuck to that, and he did it in a pretty aggressive way. Now, also on the international scene, I talked about China earlier, but the other major factor to think about during this time is the Soviet Union. Uh, Many people give Reagan credit for really undermining the Soviet Union because he pressed military spending at a very, very high level. And the Soviet Union, which never had a big economy, uh, simply was not able to spend money and could not keep up with the amount of money that America was spending on the military. Now, also at this time, really going back to 1980 with demonstrations in Poland, there was a movement called Solidarity. It became a lot harder for, it took a lot more effort for the Soviets to maintain control over Eastern Europe. So finally, uh, a Soviet leader, a fellow by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev, came into power. And as Dr. Fona mentions in the book, he pressed the policy of glasnost or openness, in which he tried not to have such a rigid authoritarian government. And also, he made the strategic decision to not try to hold on to the Eastern European countries that had been occupied by the Soviets at the end of the Second World War. And so what we see is that most of these countries, all of these countries, from Bulgaria in the southeast, all the way up to Poland in northern Europe, eventually broke away from the Soviet Union. And so what we see is that Reagan, who was very much an anti-Soviet, very much against the Cold War, was actually president of the United States when the Cold War pretty much collapsed, and Reagan and Gorbachev actually had a cordial relationship. Now, eventually, after Reagan is out of office in 1991, the Soviet Union itself would collapse, and then the various Soviet republics, like the ones in Central Asia, as well as places like Ukraine and Belarus and Moldova in Eastern Europe, they broke away. They would eventually break away from the Soviet Union. Now, of course, as we speak right now, President Putin of Russia is trying to reverse that process, and it looks like he's having a pretty difficult time doing it. We don't know how the war is going to end, but right now it's looking like if he does succeed, it's going to be a really, really bloody struggle, and there's a really good chance he won't succeed, but we don't know. But really, those were some of the major trends that I want you all to think about in terms of the last few chapters of the book. I hope the class has been informative for you, and I hope you all do well on the final exam. It always makes me feel good to see students do well on the exam, because it lets me feel that I taught you something useful. Have a good summer, and if you're going to be coming back in the fall, I hope you have a good productive year next year. If you're graduating, great luck on the rest of your life. Take care.